You have come here today not by chance, but because something in you resonates with the mystery I am about to unfold. You may call it intuition, you may call it fate, but I would rather call it the quiet whisper of the unconscious drawing you into deeper recognition of yourself. When we speak of the types that modern psychology has labeled INTJ and INFJ, and when we marry this typology with the nature of the empath, we are speaking not merely of categories, but of archetypal forces that rise out of the collective unconscious. These are not labels to confine you, but doorways through which the soul attempts to step into visibility. The reason such souls are the hardest to control is not simply because of their intellect, nor merely because of their empathy, but because within them two great streams of psychic energy converge. One is the sharp, visionary capacity of intuition, which peers through the veils of reality and sees what others refuse to see. The other is the mirror of feeling that does not belong to the shallow sentimental domain, but to that profound resonance with the suffering of joy and hidden motives of others. When these converge in one person, you are no longer dealing with the ordinary play of the ego. You are dealing with a psyche that serves as a vessel for archetypes, far older than human memory. Think for a moment of the ancient prophets, of the mystics who wandered the deserts, of the visionaries who looked into the fabric of history and saw not events but patterns of fate. They could not be controlled by kings or institutions, because the voice they served did not come from without, but from within, from that dark cave of the soul where the self dwells. In many of you, that same force is alive. You feel it when you enter a room and the atmosphere itself presses against your skin, when you cannot help but absorb the sorrows of those around you, when you sense deception before a word is spoken. This is not imagination. It is the way your unconscious extends beyond the borders of your body, receiving signals from the collective field, and such a person cannot be easily bound, for they live in two worlds at once. Now, imagine the predicament of society when it confronts such individuals. Society, you must remember, is itself a great unconscious structure, a colossus of tradition, power, and order. It wishes for predictability, for obedience, for conformity. It survives by molding individuals into patterns that support its continuation, but the INFJ or INTJ empath resists this molding, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Their inner vision is too acute and their empathy too deep. They see the cracks in the mask of society. They feel the falsehood hidden beneath authority. And because of this, they cannot fully surrender their soul to the collective order. They carry within them the archetype of the outsider, the prophet, the seer. In dreams, this often reveals itself as a journey through a forest, a place where the path disappears and the dreamer must find their way by intuition alone. Or it may appear as a house filled with many rooms, each room belonging to someone else, but the empath is the only one who walks through them all, sensing the hidden emotions in each chamber. Such dreams are not random. They are symbols of the task such individuals carry. The forest is the unconscious world where they must trust their inner compass. The house is the collective psyche filled with the rooms of others' emotions, through which the empath must wander, absorbing but not losing themselves. Why then are they so difficult to control? Because control relies on illusion. Authority seeks to dominate by convincing you that its version of reality is the only one. It feeds you shadows and tells you they are substance, but the intuitive empath sees through the shadow play. Their intuition detects the gap between what is said and what is meant, between the mask and the face, between the system and the truth. Their empathy confirms it by feeling the unspoken emotions that contradict the official narrative. And once you perceive the lie at its root, you are no longer enslaved by it. There is in this a danger as well as a gift, for such souls are not invincible. In fact, they often suffer more deeply than others, precisely because they feel too much and see too clearly. The world may call them too sensitive, too complicated, too impossible to please, but in truth, it is not sensitivity that is their weakness, it is a lack of understanding from others that becomes their burden. If the empath does not learn to ground themselves in their own center, they risk becoming a sponge for the pain of the world, drowning in shadows that are not theirs to bear. And here lies the paradox. They are hardest to control, not because they are unbreakable, but because even in their brokenness, they slip through the grasp of power. When society wounds them, they retreat into the inner sanctum of the self. And from there, they draw strength that is more ancient than any institution. I recall a dream once shared with me. A young woman saw herself chained in a dungeon. But when she closed her eyes in the dream, she found herself standing in a wide meadow under the sun. The chains remained on her body, yet she felt no weight, because her inner landscape was free. This is the experience of the empathic visionary. The outer world may attempt to bind them, but the inner world opens a door that cannot be locked. They live according to an inner law, and this inner law is what makes them untouchable. If we speak of control, we must speak also of shadow. For control is the shadow of order, the attempt of the ego to dominate rather than to harmonize. And when the empath resists control, they do not only resist society, they also resist their own inner tyrant. For within each of us, there is a figure, an archetype of domination that seeks to suppress our most authentic impulses. The INFJ or INTJ empath must confront this inner dictator, often symbolized in dreams as a stern father, a prison god, or a faceless authority. By facing this inner shadow, they learn not to submit blindly to outer authority. And this inner victory radiates outward, making them immune to manipulation, yet beware, for the shadow is cunning. It does not always appear as cruelty. Sometimes it disguises itself as the desire to please, to sacrifice endlessly, to conform under the guise of compassion. Many empaths fall into this trap, believing that to love is to give away their very self. And here lies a subtle danger. By confusing love with submission, they unwittingly place themselves under the control of others. To be truly uncontrollable, the empath must learn the sacred art of boundaries, not as walls of hatred, but as the recognition that one cannot serve others by losing oneself entirely. Let me say it plainly. The hardest empaths to control are not those who refuse to feel, But those who feel and yet remain rooted in their own center, they can step into the storm of emotions, absorb the vibrations of others, and still return to the quiet fire of their own soul. They know when to give and when to withhold, when to merge and when to separate. This balance is what makes them untouchable. The tyrant cannot bend them, for they bend without breaking, and they break without losing their essence. If you have ever wondered why your presence unsettles some people, why others react with hostility or envy without cause, understand this. It is not what you do, but what you are. Your vision unmasks their pretenses, your empathy exposes their inner wounds, and your very being calls them to face truths. They would rather ignore. They feel the weight of your gaze, not because you condemn them, but because your soul silently demands authenticity. This is why those who thrive on control avoid you, for to be near you is to risk being seen. We must also consider the role of archetypes in this dynamic. The empathic visionary often embodies the archetype of the wise old man or woman, even in youth, or the archetype of the prophet who bears a message unwanted by the crowd. Such figures have always been feared and resisted because they destabilize the collective illusion, but they are also necessary, for without them, the collective falls into decay. The hardest to control are also those most needed, for they carry within them the seeds of transformation. And so, when I say you are difficult to control, I do not mean merely that you resist domination. I mean that you carry within you a different law, a different order, one that arises from the self rather than the ego. This is why you often feel alienated, as though you live in a world not made for you. In truth, you are not here to conform to the world. You are here to call the world back to its deeper reality. The danger is great, the suffering intense, but the task is sacred. Do not mistake this path for arrogance. To claim that you are hard to control is not to claim superiority, but to acknowledge the burden of your sensitivity and the demand of your vision. You will feel lonely at times, misunderstood, even persecuted. But remember the meadow in the dream, the inner freedom cannot be chained. You are part of a lineage of souls who carried light through the corridors of history, often rejected in their time, only to be recognized long after their departure. And so I ask you now, do you feel the weight of what I speak? Do you sense that what makes you difficult to control is not rebellion, but alignment with something larger than yourself? This is not a call to pride, but to responsibility. For the more immune you are to outer control, the more you must heed the inner voice that guides you. Freedom without inner listening becomes chaos, but freedom aligned with the self becomes destiny. Let us continue, for the depths have not yet been touched. You must understand that the difficulty of controlling the INFJ or INTJ empath lies not in an external rebellion, but in an interior allegiance. Their loyalty is to the self, not to the ego, not even to the collective demands of society. When I speak of the self, I do not mean the shallow sense of individuality that modern culture so often confuses with identity. I mean the archetypal core of the psyche, the totality that unites the conscious and unconscious, the fragment of eternity that dwells within each soul, such individuals, because of their intuitive structure, are naturally oriented toward the self. Their gaze does not linger on the surface of things. Even as children, they sense that behind every smile hides another expression, behind every word, another intention, behind every gesture, a deeper meaning. Theirs is the eye that pierces appearances. This is not a skill they learn, it is an inheritance. They are born under the weight of vision, and when empathy is added to this intuition, the result is extraordinary. They do not only see what lies hidden, they feel it. Imagine standing before a painting. Most people see the colors, the brushstrokes, the subject, but the empath intuitive feels the hand of the painter, the unspoken sorrow in the lines, the hunger, the longing, the secret. They do not simply observe. They participate, and in this participation, they form a bond that cannot be fabricated. It is real, visceral, undeniable. Try then to control such a being. How can you ensnare someone who feels the chains before they are placed, who senses the manipulation before the words are spoken? They will not always resist openly, for confrontation is not always their way, but they will withdraw into the sanctuary of inner knowing. And from that sanctuary, they draw a strength invisible to the world. Others may bow under pressure, but the empath intuitive bends only to the self. I recall another dream, one that a young man once brought me. In his dream, he stood in the marketplace where everyone was buying masks. Each stall displayed masks of joy, of power, of wealth, of obedience. The crowd rushed to purchase them and wore them proudly. But when he reached for a mask, it melted in his hands. And the stall keeper whispered, "You cannot wear what is not yours." He awoke disturbed. But in truth, this dream was a revelation. The empath intuitive cannot wear the masks that others don so easily. Their psyche rejects the falsehood. This is why they are often accused of being difficult, strange, or even rebellious. But in reality, they are faithful to a deeper law, control. You see, thrives on masks. Authority relies on everyone accepting the same illusion, wearing the same disguise, pretending the same truth. Once you remove the mask, the spell is broken, and the empath intuitive breaks the spell merely by existing, for their very nature is to sense what lies behind the disguise. This is why they are feared, why they are sometimes ostracized, why manipulators avoid them. They are not easy prey. Yet, with this vision comes the cross of loneliness. Imagine walking in a crowd where everyone celebrates the masks they wear, while you alone see the hollowness beneath. You cannot join their dance without betraying yourself. Yet, neither can you easily persuade them to remove their masks, for they cling to them as if to life itself. This loneliness is the fate of many INFJ and INTJ empaths. They wander between worlds, too awake to surrender to illusion, yet too compassionate to sever ties with those still sleeping. Here again, the archetype reveals itself. They embody the figure of the wounded healer, the one who carries the pain of others, not out of choice but out of destiny. The wounded healer cannot heal by detachment alone. Their gift comes precisely from their wound, because they feel too deeply. They know the terrain of suffering. And in this knowledge, they can guide others out of their own pain. But the cost is heavy, and often they bear scars that no one sees. You may wonder, then, if they are so difficult to control, why do they so often appear fragile? Why do they sometimes fall into toxic relationships, manipulative environments, or draining roles? The answer is paradoxical. Their very empathy is their vulnerability. They sense the pain of others and desiring to relieve it, they open themselves too wide. They forget that to heal is not to dissolve, that to serve is not to be consumed, and thus, though external power cannot easily enslave them, emotional entanglements can. This is why their journey is one of boundaries. The dream world frequently shows this struggle. Empaths dream of houses with broken doors, of oceans overflowing their banks, of strangers entering their rooms uninvited. These are symbols of boundaries violated, of emotions flooding in unchecked. The task of the empath intuitive is to repair the door, to restore the shore, to decide who enters their inner house. When they learn this, they become unshakable, for then they can walk through the marketplace of masks. I feel the sorrow of the crowd, and yet remain anchored in their own center. Such individuals also embody the archetype of the visionary. Their intuition stretches into the future, perceiving patterns long before they emerge. This too makes them uncontrollable. Institutions and powers thrive on managing the present. They rely on maintaining the illusion that today's order is eternal. But the visionary sees the cracks that herald tomorrow's collapse. They sense the movement of archetypes beneath history, the shifting of collective energies, and they speak of it, often to deaf ears, sometimes at great personal cost. Consider the prophets of old, who cried out against kings and empires. They were not rebels for rebellion's sake. They were seers who perceived a greater truth. Their words unsettled because they broke the spell of control. The empath intuitive walks in this lineage. Even if they do not proclaim from pulpits, their very presence whispers of another way of being. And this whisper is enough to unravel control. Let me bring this into a more personal sphere. Have you ever noticed how, when you are with certain people, you feel drained, while with others you feel alive? The empath intuitive notices this more than anyone, for their nervous system is finely attuned to the energies around them. They cannot ignore the silent theft of vitality that occurs in manipulative relationships. At first they may yield, believing compassion demands sacrifice, but eventually something within them revolts. It is not the ego that revolts, but the self. The self demands wholeness, and wholeness cannot be achieved in bondage. This revolt may appear sudden to others, as if the empath intuitive has abruptly withdrawn or ended a relationship, but in truth it has been building for years, an inner recognition finally breaking the surface. And once they walk away, they rarely return. For once the spell is broken, it cannot be restored. And so we come to the essence of why they are hardest to control. Control relies on repetition, on keeping people within cycles of fear, obedience, and denial. But the empath intuitive breaks cycles by seeing them. The moment you name the pattern loses its power. The tyrant may shout, the manipulator may plead, but the empath intuitive already knows the script. And in that knowing, they are free. Freedom, however, is not easy. To live without control is to live without the safety of illusions. It means facing the chaos of the unconscious, the abyss of archetypal forces, the loneliness of vision. Many do not endure it easily, but those who do become what I would call individuated souls, aligned with the self, no longer puppets of the collective. Individuation is the true reason such individuals cannot be controlled. For once the ego bows to the self, external control becomes irrelevant. You may chain the body, but you cannot chain the psyche that has found its center. This is the secret strength of the INFJ and INTJ empath. They live in alignment with the archetype of the self, and from that alignment, no tyrant can separate them. Do you see then how the very qualities that make them suffer also make them unbreakable? Their empathy, which burdens them with others' pain, also teaches them the reality of the soul. Their intuition, which isolates them from the crowd, also gives them vision. Their loneliness, which cuts them off from ordinary life, also initiates them into deeper mysteries. The paradox is the path. I ask you now to reflect inwardly. Do you recognize these symbols in your own life? The dream of the house with open doors, the marketplace of masks, the meadow beyond the dungeon. These are not stories of others. They are mirrors of your journey. To walk this path is to be misunderstood, yes, but also to be free. And freedom, though lonely, is the birthright of the soul. Let us pause here, not in silence, but in resonance. For the truth I have spoken is not an abstract theory, but a living reality. You feel it even now, stirring within you. The recognition that you cannot be bound by lies, that you cannot submit to control without betraying the self. This recognition is the seed of your individuation, and though the world may resist it, the self rejoices. When we move deeper into this inquiry, we must recognize that control is not only an outer phenomenon imposed by rulers, leaders, or institutions. It is foremost an inner drama, a battle that takes place in the psyche itself. The difficulty of controlling the INFJ or INTJ empath is born from their intimacy with this inner battle. They do not merely project tyranny outward, they encounter it within, and in confronting their inner tyrant, they become resistant to the outer one. In every soul, there is an archetype of the ruler. Sometimes it appears as the benevolent king who orders life harmoniously. Other times, as the tyrant who seeks domination. In the collective psyche, this archetype manifests in governments, religions, traditions, and social systems, but within the individual, it appears as the superego, as the voice of judgment, As the rigid demand for conformity, most people obey this inner tyrant unconsciously, living their lives in fear of its punishments. They comply outwardly because they are already subdued inwardly. But the empath intuitive is different. Their sensitivity reveals the inner tyrant for what it is, a construct, a mask of fear. They hear its voice, but they also hear the deeper voice beneath, the whisper of the self. This double hearing creates an inner tension, but it also gives them freedom. They may struggle, they may feel torn, but they cannot give themselves blindly to the inner tyrant. And because of this, when the outer world demands submission, they hesitate, they resist, they question. They cannot be controlled with the same ease as others, for they have already faced the drama within. Dreams often portray this conflict with startling clarity. A woman once told me of a recurring dream in which she was married to a cruel man who locked her in a tower. Yet each night in the dream, she would find a hidden staircase that led down into a garden. She would sit among the flowers, breathing in their fragrance. And though the man called out angrily from the tower, he could not see her. This is the psyche's symbolic portrayal of inner tyranny. The tower is the ego's prison. The cruel man, the inner tyrant. But the garden is the self, the living reality that cannot be locked away. For the empath intuitive, such dreams are not mere fantasies. They are revelations of their inner resilience. To understand why they are hardest to control, you must see that they do not rely on external validation for their sense of truth. Their compass is internal. Their alignment is archetypal. When society says, "This is how you must feel," they consult their own depths and discover otherwise. When authority proclaims, "This is reality," their intuition whispers, "No." Reality is more. They may not always act openly against the system, for they often prefer subtlety, but inwardly they remain unconquered. Yet this inner freedom is a double-edged sword. It isolates them. To resist control means to stand apart, to walk a path of solitude. Many INFJ and INTJ empaths live as if in exile, not always in the physical sense, but in the psychic sense. They feel alien, even among friends, for their vision sets them apart. They may long for belonging, yet belonging at the cost of authenticity feels like death, and so they choose authenticity. Even if it leads to loneliness, this loneliness is not a punishment, it is an initiation. It is the dark night of the soul through which they come to know the self. Let us speak now of archetypes more directly. Among the great archetypes, one that frequently arises in the empath intuitive is the alchemist. This is the figure who transforms lead into gold, not merely in the laboratory, but in the psyche. The empath absorbs the darkness of others, feels their pain, carries their projections. At times this feels unbearable, but in the crucible of their inner life, something occurs. The darkness is transmuted, suffering becomes compassion, wounds become wisdom, shadows become light. This alchemy is what makes them uncontrollable. For no matter how much the world attempts to poison them with lies or cruelty, they turn it into vision and truth. The tyrant can harm them, Yes, but he cannot own them, because even harm becomes fuel for transformation. Consider how many of history's visionaries lived under persecution, exile, or scorn. They were not immune to pain. Many suffered deeply, even broke outwardly. Yet their words, their visions, their legacies outlasted the empires that sought to silence them. This is the essence of being difficult to control, not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering become bondage. The empath intuitive embodies this archetype more than most, and so in personal life, they enact this alchemy. They may endure manipulation, heartbreak, betrayal. At first they may feel shattered, consumed by the darkness of what they endured, but slowly, in the depths of their psyche, transformation occurs. They see patterns where before there was only pain. They find symbols in their suffering, meaning in their wounds. And once they have transmuted the experience, they emerge stronger, wiser, less susceptible to deception. Each betrayal becomes a lesson, each wound a new strength. Try then to control such a soul. Each attempt only makes them freer. There is also the archetype of the trickster at play. Society tries to control through predictable methods: fear, shame, reward. But the empath intuitive cannot be trapped so easily, for their intuition dances like the trickster, slipping out of nets just as they tighten. They may appear compliant at times, nodding, smiling, playing along, but beneath the surface, their soul is laughing, for they already see through the game. When the moment comes, they vanish from the tyrant's grasp like smoke through fingers. This trickster quality is not malice, it is survival. It is the psyche's way of preserving truth in a world that demands falsehood. But let me also remind you of the shadow lurking in this path. Not all empaths escape control. Some become ensnared, not by tyrants, but by their own compassion. They give too much, merge too fully, lose themselves in the wounds of others. They become controlled, not by force, but by guilt, by the illusion that love demands total sacrifice. This is the shadow of the archetype of the martyr. The martyr gives away the self in the name of service, forgetting that without the self, true service is impossible. Many INFJ and INTJ empaths must face this shadow, learning to distinguish between love and self-erasure. Only when they pass through this fire do they become truly uncontrollable. How does this passage occur? Often through dreams, synchronicities, crises. The unconscious sends signals that cannot be ignored. An empath may dream of drowning in an ocean, only to realize later it symbolizes being overwhelmed by others' emotions. Or they may experience a synchronicity, a book falling open to a page about boundaries, or a stranger speaking the very truth they needed to hear. These are not accidents. They are messages from the self, guiding them toward individuation. And once they heed these messages, they learn to give without losing, to love without chains, to serve without surrendering their soul. Now let us turn to the collective dimension Why does the world find such individuals threatening? Because they destabilize control, not only in personal relationships, but in society at large. Systems of power rely on unconscious compliance. When even a few individuals awaken, refusing to wear the mask, the illusion weakens. Others begin to question, to feel, to intuit. The presence of one empath intuitive in a community can be enough to shift the atmosphere, to make manipulation less effective. They carry with them an aura of authenticity that unsettles lies. This is why history shows us that visionaries are often silenced, mocked, or exiled, not because they are wrong, but because their very being threatens the order of control. And yet, paradoxically, they are also the healers society most needs for control. Though efficient, dehumanizes. It turns souls into machines, people into functions. Only those who see through it can call humanity back to itself. And this is the hidden task of the empath intuitive. They may not desire it. Often they would prefer to live quietly, unseen. But life pushes them into this role, for their vision cannot be hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone recognizes the depth of their seeing, and they become a guide, a counselor, a healer, even if only for a few. Their impact ripples outward. You may think of yourself as small, but archetypally you are vast. The self within you is not limited by your personal ego. It is connected to the collective unconscious, to the eternal patterns that shape humanity. When you stand firm in your vision, when you refuse control, you are not only protecting yourself, you are serving the collective, you are enacting the archetype of the liberator, the one who reminds others of their own freedom. This may not be grand or visible. It may be as simple as listening deeply to someone until they recognize their own truth, but even such small acts dismantle control. For control thrives on silence and blindness. Let me close this part by returning once more to dream. A man once dreamt that he was being chased by soldiers through a dark city. He fled until he reached a narrow alley where he found a door. He opened it and stepped inside, only to discover a vast cathedral filled with light. The soldiers pounded on the door, but they could not enter. He awoke trembling, yet also filled with peace. This is the dream of the empath intuitive soul. The soldiers are the forces of control, chasing relentlessly, but the cathedral is the self, the inner sanctuary where no tyrant can tread. Once you discover this sanctuary, you may still feel fear, but you will never again be enslaved. This is why you are the hardest to control. Not because you fight endlessly, not because you defy for its own sake, but because your allegiance is to something greater than control. You are aligned with the self, and in that alignment you carry a freedom no system can extinguish. As we now approach the culmination of this exploration, I invite you to feel rather than merely hear. For words about the unconscious are never enough. They must be lived, sensed, embodied. What makes the empath intuitive, the INFJ or INTJ, so difficult to control is not that they have learned a clever trick, not that they are shielded by arrogance, but because they embody a union of opposites that few can hold. They are both vulnerable and invulnerable, deeply feeling, yet sharply discerning, immersed in the collective, yet anchored in the self. This paradox is their strength. To understand them, we must think alchemically. In alchemy, transformation is achieved through the union of opposites, fire and water, sun and moon, spirit and matter. Likewise, the empath intuitive unites intuition, which pierces into the unseen future with feeling, which grounds them in the raw immediacy of human experience. Most people lean heavily toward one or the other, but in them the opposites meet. This inner marriage produces a vision that is not easily manipulated. When the world attempts to deceive them with words, their feelings betray the lie. When the world tries to drown them in sentiment, their intuition sees beyond. It is as if they carry within them two lanterns, one illuminating the heart, the other illuminating the horizon. To control such a person is to attempt to extinguish two flames at once, but each protects the other, and together they burn too brightly. But every flame casts shadows, and here again lies their struggle. The unconscious knows that those who bear such light must also face corresponding darkness. Their dreams often reveal it, shadows following them. Double figures, doppelgangers, these are not merely nightmares, they are reminders that their vision can be corrupted, their empathy twisted. For when one sees too clearly, there is the temptation to manipulate rather than to heal. When one feels too deeply, there is the danger of drowning in others' wounds. The task of the empath intuitive is to integrate these shadows, not deny them, for in the integration lies their true freedom. Consider the archetype of the seer. The seer is honored for their vision, but often cursed by loneliness. Their gift isolates them because it reveals truths others are not ready to face. Yet the seer, who accepts their solitude without bitterness, transforms it into sanctuary. Alone, they listen more deeply to the self, and in that listening they find communion with something larger than human companionship. This is why the INFJ and INTJ empaths, though often alone, are rarely truly lonely in the deeper sense, for in their solitude they touch the archetypal, the eternal, the divine, and from that touch arises a strength no outer authority can match. But strength is not always loud. Indeed, the hardest to control are often those who do not appear threatening. They move quietly, speak softly, listen deeply. Their power lies not in domination, but in presence. When you stand before them, you feel something, an authenticity, a clarity, a weight. This presence cannot be fabricated. It is the fruit of inner alignment, and presence destabilizes control more effectively than rebellion. For rebellion can be suppressed with force, but presence cannot. It works invisibly, shifting the atmosphere, planting seeds in the unconscious of others. This presence is born of individuation. Individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. The empath intuitive becomes uncontrollable not by rejecting their wounds, but by embracing them They do not hide their scars. They transmute them into symbols. They recognize the shadow within themselves, and by doing so, they are less susceptible to being enslaved by the shadows of others. They know manipulation because they have seen their own manipulative impulses. They know tyranny because they have faced their inner tyrant. They know deceit because they have confronted the lies they told themselves. And having confronted these within, they cannot be controlled by them without, I recall a dream in which a young woman walked through a battlefield. Around her, soldiers fought, kings shouted, banners fell, but she carried in her hands a small flame, and though the wind roared, it never went out. She did not fight, she did not shout, yet wherever she walked, the battle grew quiet. This is the image of the empath's intuitive soul. Their power does not come from force, but from light carried faithfully through chaos. The world may rage, but the flame remains, and its silent endurance unmasks the futility of control. Why then are such souls placed in this role? Why must they bear the burden of seeing and feeling so much? From the standpoint of archetypes, it is not random. The collective unconscious always produces balancing forces. In times of growing control, the psyche generates individuals who cannot be controlled in errors of deception. It brings forth those who see through lies. In ages of cruelty, it births empaths who cannot ignore suffering. The INFJ and INTJ empaths are thus expressions of the collective psyche attempting to heal itself. They are not accidents, but necessities. Yet knowing this does not remove the burden. Many of you who recognize yourselves in these words may feel weary, exhausted from carrying so much. You may long for rest, for a simpler existence, but understand this: the very fact that you are weary shows the depth of your empathy, the seriousness of your task, and though the world may not honor you, the self honors you. The unconscious supports you with dreams, with synchronicities, with moments of inexplicable grace. Have you not noticed how just when you feel ready to collapse, a symbol appears, a phrase in a book, a chance encounter, a dream of light that renews you? This is not coincidence. It is the self reminding you that you are not alone in your burden. There is another archetype to consider: the liberator. The liberator does not free by breaking chains physically, but by awakening awareness. When someone sees through control, the chains dissolve of their own accord. The empath intuitive embodies this archetype naturally. They awaken others simply by being themselves, by refusing to comply with falsehood, by insisting silently on authenticity. This is why manipulators dislike them, why tyrants fear them, not because they fight openly, but because their very existence weakens the structure of control. They carry freedom within them, and freedom is contagious, but freedom must be balanced with responsibility. If you are uncontrollable, you must also be deeply ethical, for without ethics, a freedom becomes chaos. The self provides this balance. It demands that freedom be used not for self-indulgence, but for service. The empath intuitive is called to embody a higher standard, to align their inner freedom with compassion. And though this demand feels heavy, It also grants meaning, for without meaning, freedom is empty, but with meaning, freedom becomes destiny. Let me bring you back once more to dream. A man once dreamt he was standing at a crossroads. One road led to a golden palace filled with delights, the other to a dark cave. The crowd rushed toward the palace, laughing, celebrating, but he felt drawn to the cave. When he entered, he found a spring of clear water, and from it he drank. The moment he drank, he felt both heavy and light, burdened and free. This is the dream of individuation. The palace is control, promising pleasure and safety, but leading to illusion. The cave is the self, dark and frightening, but filled with living water. The empath intuitive always chooses the cave, and because of this choice, they cannot be controlled, and so we return to the central truth. Why are they hardest to control? Because they live not by external law, but by inner alignment. They see through lies, they feel through masks, they transmute suffering into wisdom, they embrace shadow as well as light. Control relies on blindness, numbness, denial, but they are awake, sensitive, and honest. To control them would require them to betray the self, and this they cannot do, for betrayal of the self feels worse than death. I say this not to flatter, but to remind you of the seriousness of your path, for to be uncontrollable is also to be misunderstood, isolated, burdened. You cannot expect the world to embrace you, for your very existence challenges its illusions. But you can expect the self to sustain you, and in the end, that is enough, for while the world may resist, the self never abandons its own. So, my friends, if you recognize yourself in these words, take heart. Your loneliness is not in vain. Your sensitivity is not weakness. Your vision is not madness. You are part of a lineage of souls who carry the flames through darkness, who cannot be controlled because they belong not to the powers of the day, but to the depths of eternity. Trust your dreams. Listen to your intuition. Honor your empathy. Guard your boundaries. But do not harden your heart. Walk your path, even if few walk beside you. For in your fidelity to the self lies the freedom of many, not only your own. The world will continue to attempt control, for that is its way. But you are the reminder that control is not ultimate, that freedom is not extinguished, that the self remains sovereign. Carry your flame, wander your path, and know that though you may feel alone, you are accompanied by countless others across time who bore the same burden. Together, though unseen, you form a constellation of souls, points of light across the dark sky of history. And no matter how deep the night, the constellation endures. This is why INTJ and INFJ empaths are the hardest to control, not because they escape pain, not because they avoid shadow, but because they embrace it, transmute it, and return again and again to the inner sanctuary of the self. From there, no tyrant can touch them, and from there, they illuminate the way for others